The rooster's crow echoed through the small mud-brick home, the first herald of dawn in their remote village. As the morning light crept into the room, Sarah lay in bed, counting her breaths and trying to ignore the dull ache in her ribs, a constant reminder of her husband's wrath from the night before. "Sarah, get up and start cooking." The voice of her husband Okafor rang through the walls, harsh and demanding. She rose slowly, taking care not to aggravate her bruises, and glanced around their small, cramped home. The mud walls were bare, aside from the few items he had deemed worthy of display, mostly trophies of his own pride, small carvings and an old hunting knife, a remnant of his youth. Her own meager belongings were packed into a small corner, out of sight. Okafor had taken it upon himself to keep her in line, as he called it, controlling every aspect of her life. The few friends Shed once had scared away. Her dreams of traveling, studying, building something of her own had all become faded memories. She moved silently to the kitchen, boiling water for the morning meal. Every sound she made felt loud in the quiet, almost as if each clang and clatter might summon him. She kept her gaze low and her movements light, knowing that even a slight misstep could invite his ire. But this morning felt different. As she poured the steaming water into the pot, she found her thoughts wandering back to something her friend Mariam had told her. Mariam had visited just a few days ago, sneaking in while Okafor was away at the market. Her friend's words had left an imprint on her mind, resonating in ways she hadn't expected. "You're worth more than this, Sarah," Mariam had whispered urgently, gripping her hands. "You deserve a life where you're treated with respect, with dignity. This isn't the life for you." Sarah had felt a rush of anger, not at Mariam, but at herself. She had grown accustomed to hiding behind her husband's anger, using his dominance as an excuse to avoid confronting her own buried strength. But Mariam's words had ignited something within her, an ember that, though small, had refused to die down. The sharp slam of the front door jolted her from her thoughts. Okafor entered the kitchen, his face twisted in a scowl. "You're daydreaming again," he muttered, giving her a disdainful look. "Stop wasting time and get the food ready." "Yes, Okafor," she murmured, keeping her voice low. As she continued to work, she noticed him watching her, his dark eyes scrutinizing every move. He was always on guard, ready to pounce on any mistake. But today, instead of fear, Sarah felt something else. A quiet but growing defiance. It simmered just beneath the surface, like the bubbling pot in front of her. When she served him his food, he made a show of inspecting it before taking a single bite. He chewed slowly, then set the spoon down with a clank. "Is this the best you can do?" he sneered. "Even after all these years, you're still useless." A pang of pain and anger flickered in her chest, but she kept her gaze steady on the floor, waiting for him to finish. Once he left the kitchen, she returned to cleaning up, each movement laced with a newfound determination. For the first time, she felt as though the walls around her were not as permanent as she once believed. That night, as she lay on her straw mat, her husband's harsh snores filling the silence, Sarah found herself thinking of her friend's words again. Mariam had spoken of life beyond the village, of opportunities, and of men who respected women. She could almost hear Mariam's voice. "You don't have to endure this. You have the power to change your life, Sarah. But it has to be your choice." Her heart raced as she considered it. She had never known a life outside this village, outside the shadow of Okafor's anger. But maybe it was time she did. With her decision made, a new calmness settled over her. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and she knew that breaking free would mean facing unimaginable challenges. But anything would be better than living under the hand of a man who had only ever known how to break her spirit. As the hours crept by, she planned her escape with silent precision. She knew where Okafor hid his savings, how much he had hidden away from her in a small tin under the floorboards. And she knew that the strength Shed need to break free was already within her. Tomorrow, she would not be the same woman. Tomorrow, she would rise. Sarah spent the following day quietly, keeping her newfound determination hidden beneath a calm, obedient exterior. Every movement, every word she uttered to her husband was carefully measured, as if she were keeping a secret flame alive in a cage of stone. When Okafor left for his evening drink with the village men, she began the preparations. Quietly, she lifted the floor mat and pried up the loose floorboard she had seen him fiddle with countless times. Her fingers reached into the darkness beneath the planks, and she felt the cool metal of the tin box. She pulled it up, opened it, and counted the money inside. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to get her to the city. As she tucked the money away, she heard the faint creak of the door. Okafor was back. "What are you doing down there?" His voice was slurred, but his tone still held its usual sharpness. Sarah's heart pounded. She straightened slowly, a faint smile on her face. "Just fixing the mat," she replied, gesturing vaguely. It was coming loose. He snorted, his eyes narrowing as he swayed slightly. "Always fixing things that don't need fixing. Useless as ever." He slumped into the chair, glaring at her. "Get me some water." "Yes, Okafor." She moved quickly, hiding the tin under her clothes before fetching the water. Her hands shook slightly as she poured it into a cup and handed it to him. As he drank, she watched him, a mixture of emotions churning within her, fear, hatred, and a fierce, rising strength. She waited until he finished, then quietly took the cup and set it on the table. Tonight, she told herself, tonight she would finally take back her life. Hours later, Okafor had stumbled to bed, his snores filling the small room like a thunderstorm. Sarah moved silently, her movements practiced and determined. She gathered her belongings, taking only what she would need, then returned to his side. She looked down at him, taking in his heavy, sleeping form. The man who had once towered over her, whose voice had been a constant reminder of her own supposed worthlessness, now seemed so small, so powerless. Her hand shook as she reached for the rope she had found in the corner. Carefully, she looped it around his wrists, then tied his ankles to the bedpost. She worked quickly and efficiently, her fingers nimble despite her pounding heart. As she finished, she stood over him, breathing hard. The weight of years pressed down on her, mingling with a thrill of freedom she hadn't felt in a long time. Just as she turned to leave, his eyes flickered open. He blinked, dazed, then his gaze sharpened as he took in the ropes binding him. "Sarah!" His voice was a harsh whisper, filled with disbelief. "What is the meaning of this?" She leaned over him, her face inches from his, her voice low and steady. "This is my freedom, Okafor." He twisted, pulling against the ropes, but they held fast. "Untie me right now," he spat, his eyes blazing. "You'll regret this." "Will I?" Sarah's voice was calm, almost detached. She felt a strange clarity, as if she were seeing him for the first time. "I regret staying here all these years, letting you treat me like I was nothing, but that ends now." "Ungrateful woman," he hissed, straining against the bonds. "You think you can survive out there without me? You're nothing without me." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "That's where you're wrong, Okafor. I'm more than you ever allowed me to be." She reached down, patting his chest mockingly. "Enjoy your sleep. You'll need the rest." With that, she gathered her things, ignoring his muffled shouts as she left the room. She stepped outside into the cool night air, inhaling deeply. The weight of the years lifted with each breath, each step she took away from the small house and the life she had known. The road to the city was long and winding, but Sarah didn't stop, even when her legs ached and her eyes grew heavy. Dawn was breaking when she finally reached the outskirts of the city. Its skyline looming before her like a promise. She found her way to Mariam's small apartment, knocking softly on the door. Moments later, her friend's face appeared, sleepy but brightening as soon as she saw Sarah. "Sarah!" Mariam gasped, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You did it!" Sarah smiled, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "I did. I left him." They sat down, and Sarah told Mariam everything. Her years of suffering, the plan she had made, and the feeling of freedom Shed felt as she walked away. Mariam listened, her expression growing more determined with every word. "You've taken the first step, my friend," Mariam said firmly, clasping her hands. "Now it's time to show the world who you are." "But how?" Sarah asked, her voice wavering slightly. "I don't know how to survive here. I've only ever known life in the village." Mariam leaned forward, her eyes shining with a fierce determination. "You're stronger than you think. You have a fire in you, Sarah. You just need to know how to use it." The next morning, Sarah's training began. They started with posture. "Stand straight, Sarah," Mariam said, adjusting Sarah's shoulders with a firm but gentle touch. "The way you carry yourself is the first message you send. Men, people, they'll sense your strength or your weakness before you say a single word." At first, Sarah struggled to stand with her head high and her shoulders back. Years of bending under Okafor's gaze had taught her to stay small unseen, but Mariam persisted, guiding her into a stance that demanded attention. "Feel the ground beneath you," Mariam instructed, her voice calm but commanding. "You're rooted here, grounded. When you walk, each step should be deliberate, powerful. Let the world feel your presence." For hours, they practiced this, until Sarah could hold her head high and walk with a grace that felt foreign but exciting. Every step brought her closer to the woman she knew she could be. Next, Mariam taught her the art of gaze. "Your eyes are your greatest weapon," she explained one evening as they sat by the window watching the city lights. "A single look can convey confidence, defiance, even mystery. Men are drawn to the unknown. They want to be curious, to wonder what lies behind your gaze." Mariam instructed her to focus her eyes in a way that was both direct and subtle. They practiced in front of a mirror, Mariam guiding her on where to look, how to hold her gaze just long enough to spark intrigue, but not too long to give anything away. "Imagine you're looking through them," Mariam said, seeing beyond their words and intentions. "Your gaze should make them feel exposed, vulnerable, but never threatened. You're the calm in their storm." After weeks of practice, Sarah's gaze transformed. She learned to convey warmth, confidence, and mystery with a single look. It was a silent command, a hint that she was untouchable, unbreakable. Then came the lesson in voice. "Your voice must be like honey," Mariam explained one evening, handing Sarah a cup of tea. "Smooth, captivating, but with an edge. It should hint at strength and intelligence, make them lean closer to catch every word." They spent hours practicing different tones. Mariam taught her how to speak in a lower, softer register, how to let her words roll off her tongue with a natural ease. Sarah learned to pause at just the right moments, to let silence hang in the air, filling it with tension that only she could break. "Confidence isn't in what you say," Mariam said one night, her voice quiet but strong. "It's in how you say it. Make them feel as if every word is chosen carefully, as if your attention is a gift." Sarah practiced, her voice becoming smooth and melodic, carrying both strength and softness. She discovered the power of subtlety, of leaving things unsaid, creating a sense of intrigue that drew people closer. Over the weeks, Mariam showed her how to dress in a way that enhanced her presence. "You don't need expensive clothes to look powerful," Mariam told her, taking her to a small market. "It's about how you carry yourself, how you wear what you have with confidence." She helped Sarah pick clothes that suited her shape, enhancing her natural beauty without being overt. "Elegance, Sarah, is about suggestion, not exposure," Mariam advised. "Leave them guessing. Let them wonder." Each morning, Sarah dressed with care, feeling her confidence grow as she looked in the mirror. Her clothes became an extension of her strength, a way to silently declare her transformation. Finally, Mariam taught her the art of strategy. "Men are drawn to power, but they fear it too," she explained, a sly smile on her face. "Your goal isn't to overpower them, but to make them feel as if they're in control, even when you're the one pulling the strings." Mariam shared stories, examples of how Shed subtly influenced people by listening, observing, and guiding conversations without ever seeming forceful. Sarah learned the importance of patience, of knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. "Every man has a weakness," Mariam said one day, her voice low. "Find it, and you'll hold his world in your hands. Learn what he values, what he fears. Once you know his desires, his insecurities, you can control him without lifting a finger." They practiced in cafes and market stalls, Mariam teaching Sarah to read people's expressions, their body language, their tone of voice. Sarah observed how Mariam leaned in slightly when she spoke, how she laughed lightly at certain comments, how she made eye contact that lingered just a moment too long. Each encounter was a lesson, each moment a chance to practice. After weeks of training, Sarah felt the change in herself. She could feel the power she held, a quiet confidence that radiated from within. She had learned to command without words, to draw people in with a glance, a gesture, a subtle smile. On their last night together, Mariam raised a glass. "To Sarah," she said, her eyes bright with pride. "To the woman you've become. Remember, this strength is yours. It was always there. All I did was help you find it." Sarah clinked her glass, feeling a surge of gratitude and pride. She had shed her old self, stepped out of her fears, and embraced the strength she had buried for so long. As she left Miriam's apartment the next day, Sarah felt ready to take on the world. She was no longer the village girl, no longer the woman cowering under Okafor's shadow. She was Sarah, the woman who had freed herself, the woman who would conquer. With one last look at the city around her, she stepped forward, her gaze steady, her posture commanding. This was her world now, and she would rule it. Sarah's arrival in the city felt like stepping into a new life, a life buzzing with energy and possibilities. Every street, every sound was different from the village she had known. The scent of spices and diesel filled the air as people bustled past, all on their way to somewhere, for something. She quickly found work at a small restaurant as a server. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough to keep her afloat while she settled in. Her boss, a wiry man with a quick temper, grumbled and gave her orders, but she followed them with a calm, quiet confidence. She knew this job was temporary, a step, not a destination. One evening, as she wiped tables at closing time, she noticed a group of men seated at a corner table, their laughter echoing in the nearly empty restaurant. They were well-dressed, exuding the confidence of men who were used to being in charge. She could see from their suits, their wristwatches, and the casual way they ordered drinks that they were not ordinary men. Sarah approached with her practiced calm, balancing the tray gracefully, her gaze steady. As she set their drinks down, she noticed one man's eyes lingering on her a little longer than the others. "Thank you, miss," he said smoothly, giving her a smile that seemed both charming and assessing. She smiled back, a faint but confident curve of her lips, and gave him a polite nod. "You're welcome. Enjoy your drinks." She turned and walked away, feeling his eyes on her back. Her training with Mariam had taught her how to recognize this type of man, the ones who like to play with their money and their words, thinking themselves untouchable. In the village, men like him had seemed like distant figures, people she could never hope to reach. But now, they were within her grasp. The next day, she found a single red rose and a note waiting for her at the restaurant's counter. She unfolded the note, her heart beating with a mixture of excitement and satisfaction. It read, "For the woman who held my attention longer than any other. Dinner tonight? Dominic. She remembered him as the one who'd held her gaze the night before. He had the air of a man who wasn't used to hearing the word no. She smiled to herself, folding the note and slipping it into her pocket. This was her first real test, her first chance to put her training to use. That evening, she met him at an upscale lounge he had chosen, a place filled with dim lights, soft jazz, and an air of exclusivity. She wore a dress that Mariam had chosen for her, simple but elegant, hugging her figure in all the right places without being overt. Dominic's eyes lit up as he saw her enter, and he rose, giving her an appreciative look as he pulled out her chair. "You look stunning," he said, his voice smooth as he watched her settle into her seat. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft but controlled, just as Mariam had taught her. She let her eyes meet his with a slight smile, a flicker of mystery in her gaze. "This place is beautiful. It's one of my favorites," he replied, signaling the waiter for their drinks. "I like to bring interesting people here." "And am interesting?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. His eyes sparkled. "You're intriguing, Sarah. Most women can't hold a conversation beyond the surface, but you seem different. Perhaps you haven't met the right women then," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of challenge. She watched as he leaned forward, captivated. They continued their conversation over dinner, discussing everything from art to politics to business and the changing tides of the city. Sarah let him talk, nodding, smiling, and occasionally dropping a thoughtful question or comment. She didn't overshare. She didn't reveal too much. She gave him just enough to keep him leaning in, trying to understand the layers she chose not to show. The night stretched on, and with each passing minute, she could feel the hold she had over him tightening. He seemed fascinated by her calm, her quiet confidence, her refusal to be impressed by his wealth or status. As the evening wound down, he looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I'd like to see you again, Sarah," he said, his tone softened. "I can't quite place you. There's something different about you." She allowed herself a small smile. "Perhaps. I'd like to keep it that way." The next week, they met a few more times. Each time, Sarah was careful to reveal just enough to keep his interest, but never too much. She let him talk about his life, his work, his successes. She learned that he was an executive at a major company with connections that could open doors she'd only dreamed of. But more importantly, she learned his weaknesses, his pride, his need to be admired, his hunger for the thrill of a new conquest. One evening, as they strolled along the waterfront after dinner, Dominic took her hand, pulling her gently to face him. "Sarah, you have no idea what you're doing to me," he murmured, his voice low. "I haven't felt like this in a long time." She looked up at him, her gaze steady. "And what am I doing to you?" He laughed softly, a note of frustration in his voice. "You're driving me mad. You're so calm, so composed. Most women throw themselves at me, but you're different. I can't figure you out." She met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe that's the point, Dominic. Maybe I don't want to be figured out." For a moment, he looked at her, his expression torn between frustration and admiration. Then, with a sigh, he pulled her closer, his arm wrapping around her waist. "You're a dangerous woman, Sarah." She allowed herself a smile, leaning in slightly. "Only to those who let me be." As their relationship deepened, Sarah continued to practice the lessons Mariam had taught her. She played Dominic's desires like a well-tuned instrument, letting him feel in control while subtly guiding him toward the things she wanted. When she needed favors, she asked for them in a way that made him feel as if he were the one offering. When he hesitated, she would withdraw slightly, letting him feel the weight of her absence until he came back to her, more eager than before. Soon, he was introducing her to his friends, bringing her to high-profile events where she mingled with business leaders, politicians, and other powerful figures. Each encounter was an opportunity, a step further in her journey of control. She learned to charm the men around her, to listen for the hidden currents of power, the alliances, the quiet rivalries. She was careful, calculating, never drawing too much attention to herself, but always leaving an impression. Late one evening, as they sat in Dominic's high-rise apartment overlooking the glittering city lights, he turned to her, his expression serious. "Sarah," he began, reaching for her hand. "I want you to know, I'm falling for you. I want to make sure you're taken care of." She looked at him, her face carefully neutral, though her mind raced. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the confirmation of her control. "Thank you, Dominic," she said, her voice soft. She leaned closer, her hand resting on his arm. "But I don't need to be taken care of. I'm here because I want to be, not because I need to be." His eyes softened, and he pulled her closer, his grip tightening. "That's what I admire about you. You're unlike any woman I've ever known." As he held her, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. She had passed her first test. The city had shown her its secrets, and she had learned to wield them. And this was only the beginning. Sarah's allure was undeniable, a magnetic force that blended elegance with mystery. She had perfected the art of seduction in a way that was subtle yet captivating, each interaction unfolding like a carefully orchestrated dance. She didn't need to rush. She knew the power of lingering glances, of words spoken with purpose, and the gentle touch that hinted at something deeper. Every encounter was a masterpiece of unspoken promises, leaving men entranced, waiting, eager to be drawn closer. One evening, Sarah found herself in a dimly lit lounge with Daniel, a powerful figure known for his influence, but also for his aloofness. Yet here he was, leaning in, eyes fixed on her, as if she were the only person in the room. She let the silence between them build, holding his gaze with a knowing smile. She could sense his curiosity, his desire to know more of the woman who held his attention so completely. "Tell me, Daniel," she murmured, her voice soft but deliberate. "Have you ever let go of control?" He chuckled, a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "I'm not sure that's something I'm capable of." She smiled, leaning just close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. "Then you've never truly understood freedom." Her words lingered, weaving a subtle spell around him. She didn't need to reach out or make a bold move. Her gaze was enough, promising more than words could say. She would let him wonder, letting the intrigue build until it became something he couldn't ignore. In the privacy of softly lit rooms, Sarah's approach was like a slow dance, each step deliberate and captivating. She knew how to use her presence, standing close enough to make her intentions clear but distant enough to make him yearn for more. When they spoke, she held his attention with a quiet intensity, her voice barely above a whisper, drawing him in, making him lean closer, eager to hear each word. Her touch was light, a hand on his arm, a brush of her fingers across his shoulder, enough to ignite a spark without giving too much away. Her charm was in her restraint, in the way she left just enough space for anticipation to grow. As she moved, she commanded the room, every glance and every smile calculated to make him feel special, as though he were the only one who had ever seen this side of her. She made sure each interaction felt unique, tailored to him alone, even though she was well aware of the effect she had. The bedroom was no different, though Sarah's approach remained one of subtlety. She would guide him gently, a soft smile playing on her lips as she whispered instructions that held just enough authority to be irresistibly alluring. She set the pace, letting him follow her lead, teaching him to savor each moment without haste. Her hands would linger, her gaze meeting his, in a way that made time feel as though it had slowed. In those moments, she was both muse and mystery, someone he could never fully grasp but couldn't bear to let go of. She was an enigma wrapped in elegance, a woman who showed him glimpses of herself only to pull back, leaving him wanting, always waiting for more. Through every encounter, Sarah's art of seduction was not about conquest, but about creating an experience, one where she held the reins, guiding him through a world where he felt truly seen, truly desired. And when he left, he knew that he had experienced something unforgettable, something he would never fully understand, but would forever be drawn back to. Sarah had spent years perfecting the art of subtle seduction, where words and gestures held more power than any overt move. Tonight, she was meeting Alex, a confident and influential executive who prided himself on always being in control. She knew how men like him thought, and she was prepared to show him something he'd never experienced, a woman who could command the room without saying a word. They met in the upscale lounge of a hotel, the setting intimate and softly lit, creating a world apart from the bustling city outside. As he approached, Sarah waited, letting him come to her, taking in every detail of his approach. Her gaze was steady, calm, an invitation without promise. "Sarah," he said, flashing a smile, "it's rare to meet someone who has all my attention before saying a word." Sarah's lips curved in a small, knowing smile. "Maybe that's because you're used to people trying too hard to impress you." Alex chuckled, leaning in slightly. "Is that your way of saying you're not impressed?" "Not yet," she replied softly, her gaze meeting his with quiet confidence. She let a pause settle between them, savoring the way it seemed to shift the energy in the room, making him feel as though he needed to prove himself. He took the bait, laughing softly. "Challenge accepted," he said, his voice full of curiosity. They ordered drinks, and the conversation flowed easily, with Sarah allowing him to lead, at first. But whenever he tried to steer the conversation back to himself, she redirected it with a question that caught him off guard, challenging him to reveal more. "So, tell me," she said, leaning in just enough to draw him closer. "What is it you're really after, Alex? I've met many men who chase success, but there's something else behind that look in your eyes." He hesitated, surprised. No one had ever asked him that before. For a moment, he felt as though she saw through his polished exterior, and he wasn't sure how to respond. But Sarah simply waited, her silence inviting him to speak. "Well," he said slowly, "maybe I've been looking for something different. I didn't realize that until just now." Sarah gave a soft laugh, her eyes bright with intrigue. "You're more honest than I expected. Most people think they have to pretend with me." He reached for her hand, brushing his fingers over hers, testing her reaction. "And are you pretending right now?" She let her fingers rest in his for a brief moment, then withdrew, keeping her tone light yet firm. "You'll have to find that out for yourself, won't you?" In their private setting later, Sarah's approach was calculated but effortless. She set the tone, guiding him with her body language, a soft glance here, a gentle touch there, pulling him closer with every word she spoke. She let him move toward her, but every step he took, she met with a gentle resistance, a reminder that she was the one in charge. "Tell me what you think you're feeling," she whispered as he leaned in, his breath catching in anticipation. He blinked, surprised. "What I'm feeling?" "Yes," she replied, her gaze steady. "Tell me and be honest. You're used to leading, but tonight, let yourself feel." Alex took a slow breath, his usual confidence faltering as he looked into her eyes. "It's strange, but I feel like I'm finally with someone who sees me." Her smile was soft, but her words firm. "That's because I'm not interested in the mask you wear. I'm interested in what's underneath." As they talked, she guided him deeper into a world had never known, where she led the pace, her words and movements gentle but commanding. When he tried to take control, she would meet his gaze, a hint of challenge in her expression, and he would find himself surrendering, wanting her to guide him. "Relax, Alex," she whispered, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to prove anything here." The words seemed to ground him, a permission he didn't know he needed. She leaned in, brushing a soft kiss against his cheek, but held back just enough to leave him longing, waiting for her to give the next signal. She held his hand, moving close, guiding him through a dance of intimacy that was as much about her presence as it was about her touch. "Do you trust me?" she asked, her voice soft but steady, her eyes locked on his. He nodded, the vulnerability clear in his expression. "Yes, good," she replied with a smile, brushing her thumb over his hand. "Then follow my lead." By the end of the night, Alex felt as though had been taken on a journey where had surrendered completely, not out of weakness, but out of trust in her calm, commanding presence. Sarah had shown him a world he hadn't known he wanted, a world where he could let go of control and simply be. And he knew, even as he left, that he'd never look at power or control the same way again. Sarah had grown into her role as a woman of formidable allure and quiet control, mastering the art of bringing men to their knees in a way that felt less like defeat and more like revelation. Her methods were simple, yet mesmerizing, each touch and word charged with an intent that left no doubt. She was leading, and they were eager to follow. One evening she met with Leo, a high-powered lawyer known for his unbreakable confidence. They'd been in the same circles for weeks, a connection simmering between them that neither had acknowledged openly until now. When they were finally alone, she could feel his tension, the type of tension that only arose when someone was accustomed to control but had met their match. "Leo," she said, letting his name linger on her lips as she moved closer. "You think the world bends to your will, don't you?" He raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his face. "That's because it usually does." She laughed softly, moving close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence, close enough to unsettle his carefully curated confidence. "Usually," she echoed, her voice soft but with a hint of challenge. For a moment he looked down, his composure faltering, a shift she had anticipated. She reached out, her fingers grazing his arm, and he stilled, caught between surprise and surrender. She wasn't rushing, letting each touch, each glance, each moment build into a subtle crescendo. They talked in low voices, her words laced with hints of direction, her gaze steady, unyielding. She didn't need to tell him she was in control. Her presence was a steady reminder. The world outside seemed to fade as she brought him closer, leading him with gestures as delicate as they were deliberate. "What are you thinking right now, Leo?" she asked, her tone almost playful but laced with authority. He paused, clearly unprepared for the question. "I'm thinking that I've never felt like this." "Like what?" she pressed, her eyes holding his with a softness that felt like both invitation and command. Like I don't want to take control," he admitted, a vulnerability in his voice he rarely showed. She leaned in, brushing her lips near his ear, her voice a mere whisper. "Good, then let yourself feel what it's like to let go." In her presence, Leo felt himself surrendering, not only to her words but to her pace, her intent. She moved with a quiet grace, guiding him into a world where control wasn't seized but given willingly. When he tried to take a more active role, she would pause, meeting his gaze with a silent expectation until he understood she was the one in command. "Trust me," she whispered, holding his hand and leading him closer, her words soft yet firm. "I know what you need, even if you don't." He nodded, words failing him, the depth of her control both grounding and exhilarating. Their connection was an intricate dance, one that didn't rely on grand gestures but on the subtleties. Her touch on his wrist, the way her voice softened and slowed, the way she let the silence stretch between them until he felt compelled to follow her lead. Every movement was intentional, each step forward a reminder that he was in the presence of someone who knew how to guide without force, to lead without pressure. By the end of the night, he felt as though had glimpsed a part of himself he hadn't known existed. A part that reveled in surrender, not as a sign of weakness, but as an act of trust. As he left, he looked back, feeling as though had been changed, drawn into a world where power was redefined. She had shown him that true strength wasn't in taking control, but in yielding to someone who understood him beyond words. And as he walked away, he realized he'd never look at power or desire the same way again. Sarah had become a master of redefining power in her own quiet, magnetic way. Her ability to draw men into a dance of surrender wasn't born of dominance for its own sake. It was her way of showing them the strength in letting go. Word of her influence had spread, and men found themselves both curious and captivated, drawn into her orbit with a desire they couldn't quite understand. One evening, she met Mark, a renowned businessman who was known for being guarded and self-assured. His reputation preceded him, and he walked into their meeting with the same confidence he wore like armor. But Sarah was used to seeing beyond facades. She met his gaze calmly, letting him feel the full weight of her attention. Not hurried to speak or fill the space. They exchanged pleasantries over a quiet dinner, each word a prelude to the subtle game she was so skilled at playing. She listened intently, showing genuine interest, her responses thoughtful yet minimal, allowing him to feel he was seen without needing to prove anything. "You know, I don't often find myself caught off guard," Mark said, his voice low and measured. "Oh," she asked, tilting her head slightly, her eyes studying him with gentle curiosity. "Then maybe it's time you let yourself be." He hesitated, clearly unused to being the one on uncertain ground. She could see his struggle, his desire to maintain his usual composure while grappling with something he couldn't define. She leaned in, her voice a soft murmur. "It's all right, Mark. Not everything needs to be controlled." There was a vulnerability in his gaze, and she saw him take a deep breath, allowing himself to relax in a way that felt both new and unfamiliar. As they spent more time together, Sarah guided him through her world, showing him that real intimacy wasn't a matter of control, but of allowing himself to be present, unguarded. When he tried to lead, she would give him a look, soft but unwavering, and he'd find himself surrendering as if compelled by her quiet authority. "I'm not used to this," he confessed one evening, caught between fascination and uncertainty. "That's the beauty of it," she replied, brushing her fingers over his hand, her touch light but grounding. "You don't have to be." Her words lingered, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and curiosity. She moved closer, each step intentional, letting him feel the weight of her presence. She made sure every touch, every glance was a reminder that he didn't need to prove himself, that in her presence he could simply be. In the privacy of their moments together, Sarah's power was in the way she listened, in the gentle authority she exuded without force. When he tried to take control, she would hold his gaze, a knowing smile on her lips, waiting for him to understand that this wasn't his domain. She would then guide him, her voice soft yet firm, showing him how to let go without losing himself. "What is it that you really want, Mark?" she asked one evening as they sat together, the room filled with the quiet hum of music and low light. He looked at her, struggling with the question. I want to feel free," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, reaching out to brush a hand along his shoulder. "Then let me show you." Sarah's presence was transformative, turning each encounter into a journey of discovery, where power was defined by the willingness to trust and let go. She didn't need to control with words. Her silent strength and the way she carried herself were enough. She allowed each man to feel as though he was uncovering something deeply personal, as if she held up a mirror to their truest selves, encouraging them to see power in a new light. With Mark, as with others, her approach was rooted in subtlety. She would lead them through each experience with gentle nudges and a steady gaze, guiding them to understand that strength wasn't about dominance, but about allowing themselves to be vulnerable. By the end of each encounter, they were changed, drawn into her world, a world where control was redefined and surrender became a gift rather than a weakness. For Sarah, this was her art, the ability to bring men to a place where they felt seen, respected, and understood, where they left feeling both powerful and freed, with a new understanding of what it meant to truly let go. Sarah's influence had become more than a reputation, it was a myth. People whispered about her, how men would go to her full of confidence and leave as if they'd glimpsed a new side of themselves. For Sarah, this wasn't about collecting admirers. It was a way of channeling her own power, of rewriting the story that had once kept her bound. She had transformed from a woman trapped by another's control to one who understood how true strength could lie in the quiet confidence to lead, to guide, and to release. One evening, she received a letter from a man she'd met months ago. In it, he wrote, "You showed me the strength I didn't know I had. I came to you thinking I knew power, and you taught me it was something I'd never imagined. You made me feel seen, and I've carried that with me since." As she read the letter, Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of her journey. She had walked through darkness, reclaiming her life, shaping her own path. Each person she'd encountered had become part of her growth, helping her see that power wasn't in breaking others, but in lifting them up, in guiding them to discover something more. In her final encounter, she stood in front of a mirror, staring at the woman she had become. The strength in her eyes, the confidence in her stance, all of it was a testament to the journey she had taken. Sarah no longer needed to prove herself to anyone, not to men, not to her past, and certainly not to her own reflection. She had claimed her own story, turning her pain into power, her vulnerability into strength. She had found a place where she was truly free, not because she had control over others, but because she was in control of herself. And with that, Sarah walked into the world once more, ready to write her next chapter, knowing that her power would be felt, but more importantly, that it would resonate far beyond the walls of any room she entered. She was her own master, her own story, and with every step forward, she continued to prove that true power was simply being unafraid to be exactly who she was.